Hey, we're going to talk a little bit about probability and some of the language around probability and the words that we use to describe certain things. So probability is just simply the chance of something happening. If we say how likely something is to happen, we say, well, what's the probability of it happening? And we can use words or we can use numbers, and we're going to find out a little bit about those in a minute. Let me ask you this question. What's the probability that the Sydney Swans will win the A-League? Now, if you're not in Australia or you don't follow sport, this may not be much of a question for you, but if you know a little bit about Australian football and different codes, you'll know that the Sydney Swans don't even play in the A-League. They're an AFL team. So we would say that the probability of them winning the A-League, which is our soccer competition, is impossible. They can't win it because they don't play in it. So down at the one end of the scale, we can use the word impossible for something that just cannot happen. At the other end of the scale, though, we have things that will definitely happen. So what's the probability that the day after Saturday will be a Sunday? Well, every week, that's what happens. Sunday comes after Saturday. So we know it's certain. We can rely on it. So we would say that the probability of this happening is certain. And you'll see I've got that at the other end of my scale here to represent the two ends of the scale. One end is impossible, and at the other end, something that's definitely going to happen is certain. What about this one? What's the probability that if I toss a coin, it will come up heads? Now, there's only two sides to a coin. There's the tail side and the head side. So we would say, if someone was to describe that in words, they would describe that as like 50-50. It's one or the other. Or in other words, you could say there's an even chance of that happening. Okay, so they're the words we can use to describe something that is, it's only one of two options. What about, though, if I took a die and I rolled it, what's the probability that it would show 2 or less? So if you think about a dice or a die, you know it's got 6 sides and they're numbered 1 through to 6. So of those sides, there's only 2 of them that have 2 or less. There's 1 and 2. Right, so there are 2 options. So out of 6, 2 chances out of 6, I know that's not likely to happen. So the word I could use to describe that would be it's unlikely to happen. It's possible, it's definitely possible, but it's unlikely because there are 4 other numbers that could come up. What about this one? What's the probability that your birthday will fall on a weekday? Now think about a week. There's 5 weekdays and 2 days that are on the weekend. So most of the days are weekdays. So the probability of you being born on a weekday is actually quite likely because most of the days are weekdays. So we would say that that just is likely. So you can see these are the kind of words that we use when we're describing how or the chance of something happening. Okay, we can also use numbers. So for things that are impossible, that just cannot happen, we give them a probability value of 0. And at the other end, for things that are certain to happen, we give them a probability value of 1. Okay, so if something's definitely going to happen, we say it's got a probability of 1. In the middle, right between those two, 50-50, is halfway between those numbers. So halfway between 0 and 1 is 0.5. So something that has a probability of a 50-50 chance or an even chance, the probability is 0.5. If something was unlikely, then it would sit down here between 0 and 0.5. Or if it was likely, it would be more than 0.5 but less than 1. Let's look at a couple of examples. Our little formula that you may have come across before for probability is we take the number of successful outcomes and we divide it by the number of possible outcomes. Let's have a look at some examples to help explain what we mean by those terms. What's the probability that if I rolled a die, I'd roll a 6? Now let's think about that. There are 6 possible outcomes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So the number of possible outcomes, this bottom part of my fraction, will be 6 because there are 6 possible outcomes. So for me, a successful outcome in this case would be rolling a 6. Only one of those sides would be a successful outcome for me. So my number on the top of the fraction here would be 1. There's one successful outcome out of 6 possible outcomes. So I would say the probability is 1 out of 6. Now I could also put that in my calculator and get a value of 0.17. because 1 divided by 6. And I can see that that sits down here between 0 and 0.5, so I would say it's unlikely. And that makes sense. 1 chance out of 6, I would say that's unlikely. Okay. What about the probability of rolling an odd number? Well, I know that there's 3 odd numbers out of 6 possible numbers. So 3 successful outcomes, because 3 of them represent odds, out of 6 possible outcomes. If I put that in my calculator, I get 0.5, which I know is my probability value for something that's 50-50. And that makes sense because half the numbers on a die are odd, half of them are even. So there's a 50-50 or an even chance. What about the probability of rolling a 7? Well, most of your dice, if you have a look in your game or something, pull it out, unless it's a special dice, it goes from 1 up to 6. There is no 7. So the probability of rolling a 7, it's impossible. There are 0 successful outcomes out of 6 possible outcomes. Put that in your calculator, you get it as 0, and that represents this end of my scale here where we say it is impossible. There's some words and numbers that we use to represent probability. It's always going to be between 0 and 1. So if you get a value for probability that's more than 1 or it's less than 0, check it. You've probably done something wrong. But you saw all those examples give us a number between 0 impossible, 1 being certain. We write that like this in mathematical terms. 0, right? Probability is greater than or equal to 0. It's also less than or equal to 1. It sits somewhere between those two numbers. And there was an example that we did earlier. All right, good job, everyone.